The suburban neighborhood lay quiet, the faint rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the only sound breaking the silence. The house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, modest yet welcoming, a symbol of family life carefully maintained. But within its walls, something deeper brewed, hidden beneath layers of routine and quiet smiles. Laura, the second wife of an accomplished man in his 40s, had once believed this house would be her haven. Her husband, Richard, was a driven businessman whose attention was often monopolized by his work. Despite his success, he had the habit of maintaining emotional distance, a trait Laura had initially found intriguing, but now found alienating. Their home was shared with Emma, Richard's 17-year-old daughter from his first marriage. Emma had been reluctant to accept Laura as part of her world. Over time, however, the hostility melted into a reserved cordiality, punctuated by moments of shared understanding. Laura often spent her days alone, filling the hours with homemaking and freelance work. While Richard's absence left her yearning for connection, Emma's presence grew increasingly noticeable. The girl possessed a quiet confidence, her sharp wit and insightful remarks hinting at a depth Laura found fascinating. What began as a desire to bond with Emma morphed into a peculiar fascination. One evening, as they sat in the living room watching an old movie, Emma casually leaned closer to Laura, their shoulders brushing. The warmth of the contact sent a small ripple through Laura's chest, a fleeting sensation that unsettled her. She dismissed it, attributing it to her longing for companionship. Emma had always been observant, her adolescent angst honed into an acute ability to read people. She noticed Laura's loneliness and how her father's absence carved an invisible chasm in their home. Emma began seeking out Laura not out of pity, but because she felt an inexplicable pull toward her stepmother's gentle presence. One Saturday morning, as they prepared breakfast together, their hands brushed while reaching for the same plate. Laura pulled back quickly, her cheeks coloring, but Emma only smiled, a knowing, enigmatic curve of her lips. The tension was subtle, simmering beneath the surface, yet undeniable. Both women felt it but avoided acknowledgement. It was an unspoken understanding that they dared not articulate, as if naming it would make it real. Richard began to notice the peculiar closeness between his wife and daughter during family dinners. Emma's glances lingered on Laura a moment too long, and Laura seemed overly attentive to Emma's every word. At first, he dismissed it as his imagination, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Over the following weeks, Laura and Emma's interactions grew bolder, though always cloaked in the guise of normalcy. They took walks together, cooked side by side, and often found themselves alone in the evenings when Richard worked late. Each shared moment brought them closer, and the boundaries of their relationship began to blur. One night, while browsing through family photo albums, Emma leaned into Laura's shoulder, pointing at an old picture of her mother. "You're nothing like her," Emma said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made Laura glance at her. The girl's gaze was intense, vulnerable yet searching. Vulnerable yet searching. Laura's breath caught, but she quickly changed the subject, brushing the moment away like a stray thread on her sleeve. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of Emma's words or the way her heart had raced in response. Richard, meanwhile, began to grow uneasy. He noticed how Emma sought Laura's company more often than usual and how Laura seemed more engaged with Emma than with him. Small incidents fed his suspicions, like the way Emma lingered by Laura's side during a recent dinner party or how Laura seemed distracted whenever he tried to discuss their plans. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Richard noticed Emma's hand resting on Laura's arm. It was an innocent enough gesture, but the familiarity of it gnawed at him. His jaw tightened, and he excused himself, retreating to his study under the pretense of work. The tension reached a breaking point during a family movie night. Laura and Emma shared the couch while Richard sat across from them, his gaze flicking between the two. Emma leaned her head against Laura's shoulder, a gesture that seemed too intimate for Richard's liking. "Emma," he said sharply, breaking the silence. "Why don't you sit properly?" Emma's eyes met his, a challenge glinting in their depths. "Why does it matter, Dad?" "We're just watching a movie." Laura shifted uncomfortably, her face flushing as she avoided Richard's gaze. The atmosphere grew heavy and the movie played on, but none of them paid attention. Richard's confrontation later that night, as Laura prepared for bed, Richard confronted her. "Do you think I don't notice?" he asked, his voice low but edged with steel. "Notice what?" Laura replied, feigning ignorance, though her heart pounded in her chest. "The way you and emanate, the way you in her chest, the way you and Minmact around each other." "It's not normal, Laura." She bristled at his tone. "What are you implying?" "You know exactly what I'm implying," he snapped. "I see the way she looks at you. And the way you let her." Laura's breath hitched, but she held her ground. "You're being ridiculous, Richard. She's just a teenager looking for attention?" He scoffed. "You're giving her more than just attention, Laura. Don't think I haven't noticed." The argument escalated, each accusation cutting deeper than the last. Richard stormed out of the room, leaving Laura alone with her thoughts. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling. Emma, overhearing the argument, felt a mix of guilt and defiance. She waited until Richard left the house the next morning before approaching Laura in the kitchen. "I heard what he said last night," Emma said softly. Laura froze, her back to Emma. "That's nothing," she replied. Emma stepped closer, her voice trembling. "It's not nothing, Laura. He doesn't understand." Laura turned to face her, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken emotions hanging heavy in the air. "Emma," Laura began, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't." But before she could finish, Emma interrupted, her eyes shining with determination. "I don't care what he thinks. I care about you." Laura's resolve wavered, the line between right and wrong blurring even further. The household tension reached a new height when Richard suggested a weekend getaway to their lake house. He framed it as a way to reconnect as a family, but both Laura and Emma sensed the underlying motive, an attempt to monitor their relationship more closely. The lake house stood secluded, surrounded by tall pines and the endless stretch of water that glistened under the sun. The isolation magnified every interaction. During the first evening, Richard initiated a family dinner on the porch. The conversation was stilted, each participant struggling to maintain the facade of normalcy. When Emma laughed at one of Laura's jokes, Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped his fork. Laura noticed but said nothing, her focus divided between maintaining the fragile peace and suppressing her growing unease. The second day, Emma invited Laura to join her for a walk along the lake. Richard hesitated but didn't intervene, choosing instead to watch them from the deck. As they walked, Emma's demeanor shifted. She teased Laura about her overcautious nature, nudging her playfully when Laura avoided stepping too close to the water. "You're always so careful," Emma remarked, her tone light but probing. "Sometimes I think you're scared of what you really want." Laura froze mid-step, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Emma smirked but didn't answer, leaving Laura to stew in her own thoughts. The tension between them grew heavier, their exchanges laced with an unspoken understanding that neither dared to voice. Back at the lake house, Richard's suspicions hardened. That evening, he asked Emma to help him with some chores separating her from Laura. It was a calculated move, one that gave him the opportunity to confront his wife once again. "You two have been spending a lot of time together," Richard began, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Laura busied herself with tidying up, avoiding his gaze. She's just a teenager, Richard. She needs someone to talk to. That's not all it is. And you know it, he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped, heavy with accusation. I see the way she looks at you, Laura. And the way you look back. Laura's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. You're imagining things, she said firmly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, his silence more damning than words. Finally, he muttered, If I find out you've crossed a line, Laura, there'll be no coming back from it. That night, Emma slipped into the living room where Laura sat staring at the fire. She was barefoot, her hair slightly disheveled, and her presence sent a ripple of tension through the room. You look upset, Emma said, sitting beside her. Laura shook her head, her gaze fixed on the flames. It's nothing. It's Dad, isn't it? Emma pressed, her tone soft but insistent. Laura turned to her, the weight of the day's events etched on her face. Emma, you have to stop. Whatever this is, it has to end. Emma's expression hardened. Why? Because he said so, he doesn't get to control how I feel. Or how you feel, Emma, Laura started, but the younger woman leaned in, her proximity cutting off the words. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, the crackling fire the only sound in the room. Then, as if realizing the danger of the moment, Laura pulled back, her voice trembling. Go to bed, Mama? No, Emma hesitated but finally rose, her gaze lingering on Laura before she turned and disappeared down the hall. The final day at the lake house brought an eruption of the tension that had been simmering all weekend. Richard returned early from a morning fishing trip to find Laura and Emma sitting on the dock, their heads close together in conversation. He stood frozen, watching them. From his angle, it seemed as though Emma's hand lingered on Laura's knee, a gesture too intimate to be innocent. That night, as the family packed to leave, Richard cornered Emma in the kitchen. You think I don't see what's going on? He hissed, his voice low but venomous. Emma met his gaze defiantly. I don't know what you're talking about. You stay away from her? He growled. You're crossing lines you can't uncross, Emma smirked, her defiance cutting through his anger. Maybe you should be asking her what lines she's crossing, Dad. Her words struck him like a slap, and he stormed out, his fury barely contained. The tension came to a head the evening after they returned home. Richard's suspicions reached a boiling point, and he finally demanded answers during dinner. His patience snapped. Enough, he said, slamming his fork onto the table. His voice cut through the quiet, startling Laura and Emma. We need to talk, he said, his gaze flicking between them. Now he led them into the living room, where he stood facing them like a judge about to deliver a verdict. I've had enough of the lies and the secrets, he began. Something is going on between you two, and I want the truth. Laura's face paled, but she forced herself to speak. Richard, you're overreacting. There's nothing, don't lie to me, he roared, his voice echoing through the room. Emma stepped forward, her chin held high. Why does it bother you so much, Dad? Is it because you know she's happier with me than she's ever been with you? Richard's face contorted with rage. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think I do, Emma shot back, her voice dripping with defiance. Enough. Laura's voice cut through the argument, silencing them both. She turned to Richard, her eyes blazing. This isn't about Emma or me. This is about you, your insecurities, your inability to connect with anyone on a real level. Don't you dare make this about us. Richard stared at her, stunned into silence. Without another word, Richard grabbed his keys and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. Emma sat beside her, hesitating before placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. He's gone, Emma whispered. Laura lifted her head, her eyes filled with tears. This isn't over, Emma. Not by a long shot. But Emma only smiled faintly as though she had already won the battle. The house felt different without Richard's presence. The air seemed heavier, silence wrapping itself around every corner like an oppressive fog. After his sudden departure, Laura was left to pick up the pieces. She spent the next morning in a daze cleaning the already spotless kitchen and avoiding Emma's gaze. Emma, on the other hand, seemed almost emboldened by Richard's exit. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, her movements deliberate, as though she'd won some unspoken battle. "Are you okay?" Emma finally asked as she found Laura standing by the window, staring out into the garden. Laura flinched at the sound of her voice. "I'm fine," she replied curtly. Though her tone betrayed her unease, Emma stepped closer, her voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to lie to me, Laura. I know this is hard for you." Laura turned to face her, her expression a mixture of frustration and desperation and desperation. "Emma, you don't understand. Richard may have left, but this isn't over. He'll be back, and when he does, things will only get worse." Emma's gaze didn't waver. "Then let him come back." "I'm not afraid of him." Laura shook her head, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "He said she whispered. Richard returned 2 days later, unannounced. The sound of his car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of anxiety through Laura. She watched from the window as he stepped out, his face set in a grim mask. When he entered the house, he didn't greet anyone. Instead, he went straight to the living room, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Sit," he commanded, his voice low and cold. Laura and Emma hesitated but complied, taking seats across from him. The tension in the room was palpable, this silence stretching on until Richard finally spoke. "I've had time to think," he began, his gaze fixed on Laura, "and I've come to a decision." Laura's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "What decision?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This ends now, whatever. Connection the two of you think you have, it stops here. I won't let this family fall apart because of your indiscretions." Emma bristled at his words. "You don't get to dictate how we feel, Dad?" she shot back, her tone defiant. Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to her. "You're a child, Emma. You don't even know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Emma retorted, her voice steady. Before Richard could respond, Laura stood, her voice cutting through the rising tension. "That's enough, both of you." She turned to Richard, her expression firm. "You don't get to control this family through fear. If you want to fix things, then we need to have an honest conversation. But if you're just here to throw accusations, then you can leave." Richard stared at her for a long moment before finally standing. "You're right, we do need to talk, but not like this." Without another word, he left the room, leaving Laura and Emma alone once again. That evening, Laura retreated to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. The weight of everything Richard's accusations, Emma's defiance, her own conflicted emotions felt unbearable. She thought about leaving, about packing a bag and disappearing, but the thought of abandoning Emma stopped her. Despite everything, she felt an inexplicable sense of responsibility for the girl, a need to protect her even as their relationship threatened to destroy them both. A soft knock on the door broke her train of thought. "Laura?" Emma's voice was quiet, hesitant. Laura didn't respond. But after a moment, she heard the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. The next morning, Laura woke with an unearning. She couldn't let the situation spiral any further. She needed to make a choice for herself, for Emma, and for the fragile remains of their family. She found Emma in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea. "We need to talk," Laura said, her voice steady. Emma looked up, her expression guarded. Her expression guarded. Her expression guarded. Her ex- About what? About us, Laura replied, taking a seat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Laura took a deep breath and began, Emma, I care about you more than I probably should. But this, whatever it is between us, it can't continue. It's not healthy for you, for me, or for this family. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I don't care about what's healthy, Laura. I care about you. I know, Laura said softly, but sometimes caring isn't enough. We have to think about the consequences of our actions. About what's right? Emma shook her head, her voice breaking. I don't want to lose you. You're not losing me, Laura assured her. But things have to change. We have to set boundaries. Emma nodded reluctantly, tears streaming down her face. Okay, she whispered. Later that day, Richard called a family meeting. His demeanor was calmer, but his expression was still serious. I've been thinking, he began, his gaze shifting between Laura and Emma. And I've decided that the best thing for all of us is some time apart. Laura's heart sank, but she nodded. If that's what you think is best. It's not about what I think, Richard said. It's about what we all need. This family is broken, and we can't fix it if we're all at each other's throats. He turned to Emma. You'll stay with your mother for a while. She's agreed to take you in. Emma's eyes widened in shock. You're sending me away? It's not permanent, Richard said quickly. It's just until things settle down. Emma looked to Laura, her expression pleading. You're okay with this? Laura hesitated, but she finally nodded. I think it's for the best, Emma. We all need some space. The next morning, Emma packed her things, her movements slow and deliberate. Laura helped her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. When it was time to leave, Emma turned to Laura, her eyes filled with sadness. Will I ever see you again? Of course you will, Laura said, pulling her into a hug. But for now, we need to focus on ourselves, on healing. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll miss you. I'll miss you too, Laura whispered. As Emma climbed into the car with her mother, Laura watched from the doorway, her heart aching. She knew it was the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. In the weeks that followed, Laura and Richard began to rebuild their relationship slowly and cautiously. They attended counseling, learning to communicate in ways they hadn't before. Emma wrote letters to Laura, each one filled with reflections and apologies. Laura kept them in a drawer, reading them when she felt lonely. Though the family remained fractured, there was a sense of hope, a belief that, with time, they might find a way to heal. As Laura stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she felt a sense of peace. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face it one step at a time.